welcome to episode 2 of Art Uncensored. Brief introduction for those of you that are just tuning in and did not listen to my first episode. My name is Emma, and I'm an art fanatic that runs this podcast as a way of introducing people that may not be familiar with art to the art world, as well as covering a lot of maybe lesser known facts and clearing up the fiction that surrounds many famous artists, and of course delving into my favorite part, which is the wild conspiracy theories that art fanatics have come up with about some of the world's most famous art pieces. Before I jump into this week's theme, I have some news. We hit 25 downloads. I know it seems like nothing, but to me that's huge, considering I thought that pretty much only my dad and my best friends were going to listen to this. B, I am running out of art-themed apparel for the Instagram account. I have the Starry Night plugs, I have the Mona Lisa socks. When I'm not in Ireland, I have more art apparel, but with me it's pretty limited, so I'm going to have to start getting really creative with the posts. Another final note. We are reaching record-breaking heat for Ireland. It was 78 degrees today. It's the hottest day of the year. I'm not sure if it's the hottest day ever recorded. Probably not, but we're definitely sweating today. Got in some pool time. So tonight's episode is brought to you by Thank God for Air Conditioning and Jack Daniel's cider, which I discovered in Dunn's today. All very interesting stuff. And so, here we go. Episode 2, we're going to talk about Vincent van Gogh. And this is one of my favorite quotes from today's featured artist. If you hear a voice within you say, "You cannot paint," then by all means paint, and that voice will be silenced. So why we're doing this topic today is A, it's inspirational to all who suffer from varying forms of mental illness, and B, to tell the true story of Van Gogh, because there's definitely been, especially in recent years with the advent of Tumblr and other forms of social media, there's been a lot of not necessarily true facts. So it's funny, I even call them facts, alternative facts, if you will, about Vincent van Gogh, particularly his mental illness. So this episode isn't just going to be about mental illness, but we are going to talk quite a bit about what's true and what's not. But first, there's a 10-minute history. So he was born into a family of art dealers and preachers. I remember reading that his father and his grandfather were both preachers, and then his uncle, I think maybe he had maybe more than one uncle, but a few of them were art dealers. So he was definitely familiar with both religion and the art world, and we're going to see how that ties into later in the story. He was one of 6. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and I didn't actually research that much about any of his siblings except for his brother Theo, who he was very, very close to and actually kept in close correspondence with for his entire life. And he was known to be a rather unpleasant and quarrelsome child, and he suffered from a facial deformity that suggested he may have had an early brain injury, which could have been the reason for his later psychological problems. He started working as an art dealer apprentice at the age of 16 and moved to London at age 20 and lived there for 2 years. And this is the first time that we have recorded, where he displayed signs of depression. He suffered a heartbreak and an unrequited love, and it cast him into this very dark period of time, which he wrote about to his brother Theo. And from that stemmed an interest in religion, and he attempted to become a preacher for 4 years, but continuously failed to achieve his theology degree, and so he instead became an evangelist in this very, very poor Belgian community. And he was there for a while, but I actually kind of couldn't understand this part of the article that I was reading. They said that he was, quote-unquote, too generous, and that it was unbecoming of someone of his position, and so the church actually dismissed him for being incompatible, and this caused him to fall into his second deep depression. And I say second because it's the second one we have on record, but I'm guessing he probably struggled with it most of his life. Anyway, he felt really abandoned by the church, and so he left it completely and became a Gnostic. And he wrote, "Though I have changed, I am the same." And this quote really resonates with me, just because people always see me and are like, "Oh, Emma, you've changed so much." Because, I used to be this super, super hardcore punk, goth kind of girl, and now I just look different, but I'm still the same person. I express it in different ways. So I definitely relate to that quote. "Though I have changed, I am the same." And this is when he started to pursue his art career. And his brother Theo, who I mentioned earlier, actually supported him his entire life and kept in close correspondence, as I said, up until his death. And he sent him money for his art supplies. He believed that he truly believed that Vincent was a genius. And they wrote each other pretty much every single day, which I thought was really, really cool. I definitely have some very close connections with my siblings as well, so even more reason for me to deeply relate with Van Gogh. And so that's the summary of his history. I'm sure it wasn't actually 10 minutes. I always call it a 10-minute history in my head, but that's okay. We're going to jump into the meat of this podcast, which is mental illness. And there have been many theories as to what he actually suffered from, and there's no official diagnosis, although theories include epilepsy, schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety. And the schizophrenia one actually did make the reason they really thought that was because one of his sisters was actually put in an asylum where she lived pretty much her entire life and died at the age of 70-something, and she was believed to have had schizophrenia. And so mental illness was actually, I think there were other siblings that also had mental health issues, and so it definitely ran in the family. So none of this was surprising to me. However, Van Gogh's own doctor reported, and this is a quote, that the artist's psychiatric changes were based on temporal lobe epilepsy produced by the use of absinthe in the presence of an early limbic lesion. So he did drink a lot of absinthe, which is very common among French artists, and it's got horrible effects on the brain, and so they kind of thought that that's why he would go into these fits. And he did report having seizures and going into these really dark places that he couldn't really escape from, but then he also, when he finally got out, he couldn't remember. And I found that really, really, really interesting. And here's kind of where my issue with Van Gogh comes, well, not necessarily with Van Gogh, but with the story of Van Gogh comes into play, because so many people are eager to romanticize the connection between mental torture and artistic genius. And it's become so much to the point that people express this desire to achieve the same level of insanity because they believe it will allow them to tap into their own hidden artistic potential. And this is very prevalent to me in the Tumblr community, where kids are often trying to imitate Van Gogh's lifestyle and basically give themselves unnecessary issues because they believe that it will encourage them or encourage their minds to open up. And may I just say, it's really not a wise decision, because the guy suffered. He was tormented his entire life, and we'll later talk about how he actually didn't personally believe that his genius came from his insanity. And actually there's an exhibition at the Van Gogh Museum that supports this alternative stance and views his struggle with mental illness actually as an impediment rather than inspiration. And the support for this claim comes from all letters, paintings, and the actual revolver used in his suspected suicide. And my personal thoughts on this are that it's completely undeniable that Vincent van Gogh possessed incredible artistic genius. And the argument presented shows that at his worst, Van Gogh was not actively pursuing art. And I can relate to this deeply because I know that when I was at my worst, I abandoned art for months. I didn't draw. I didn't paint. The thought of it made me nauseous. Like I couldn't bring myself to do it. And so that's where I start to really connect with this theory that his genius did not flow from insanity, but rather that his genius was an uphill battle with his insanity. And they go on to talk about how he actually cut off his entire left ear with a razor blade. Traditionally, the story is that he cut off his earlobe, which is still really horrifying, but definitely, it wouldn't be that difficult, whereas severing your entire ear is an incredible, and when I say incredible, I mean it not in a good way, but it's an incredible form of self-mutilation. And he actually later said that he did not remember doing it, but there it is, he chopped off his own ear. And they say that the painting was actually much less of an expression of his illness, but an actual internal struggle to maintain sanity. So he was like hanging in the balance, and the only thing keeping him from going completely down into the dark was his painting. And so, as I said, a long sufferer of mental illness, and as an artist myself, I could definitely agree that the depression, especially the depression, it's anxiety, not so much the bipolar disorder that some people say he may have had. I could see where the manic episodes would encourage more creativity, but the depression especially is often more than a hindrance. It's so very hard to see color when the world looks black. And looking back, you just feel so uninspired, and anything you do you hate and you just want to throw it away. And you get to these very, very dark low points, and you feel abandoned by your own creativity because it's the one thing that you found joy in and now you can't even do it. Sometimes I'm unsure if the depression stemmed from my lack of inspiration or if the depression sent my inspiration packing for the hills. I don't know sometimes. And I think that this is maybe what Van Gogh meant when he mentioned wondering if madness and genius were actually inseparable. You don't know where one ends and one begins. And I often find my work as more of an escape or outlet than a representation of my mental state. A lot of times people look at my paintings and are like, wow, I can see you were in a really dark place here. And I kind of look at them like, no, that wasn't what that was supposed to be. And they misinterpret that because they kind of romanticize what they know about me and put it into my artwork. And that's kind of probably something that a lot of fellow artists would agree. People always try to see symbolism where it's not there, or maybe it's there, but they totally misinterpret it. But anyway, I digress. I paint, going back to this idea of an escape or outlet rather than representation. When I'm down, for want of a better phrase, I paint what I wish was real and not the reality that I face. So a lot of my art gets super whimsical. It gets super childish almost. It's always like super happy, super enlightened. And that would, if I was painting from my feelings, it would mean, oh, she's happy. She painted a happy picture. And often it's quite the opposite, where my pictures get happier the worse I become. So I could definitely understand this argument that he used his beautiful paintings and the sunflowers were so joyous. The painting of the chair with his pipe, the ultimate picture of serenity, because for him, he found peace in smoking his pipe. And he wanted to see himself as this humble and practical, reliable person. And on the straw seat he left the pipe and tobacco he hoped might remedy this inner darkness. And I really love this quote. He has gone out into the fields. And it's bittersweet because it brings such peace, but if you know the story of Van Gogh, he committed suicide in the field, and that painting was one of his last, and a lot of people actually believe it was his way of a suicide note. I can also see the flip side of the argument, the more traditional side, that in desperate times we turn to what makes us happy, and were it not for the desperation produced from mental illness, a lot of us wouldn't tap into our full potential. But I can see it, but I don't agree, because I believe that the genius is not produced from madness. The genius exists all along, and unfortunately, it's insanity that often brings it out, but I also believe that there's so many ways to discover genius without mental health issues. And I'm not saying that, you can't suffer with mental health issues and still be creative, but it's more of that there's other ways. You don't have to be insane to be a genius. I would say that madness is more a side effect of genius, and that people suffer due to circumstance. And it's such a hard subject because the traditional argument is always, oh, insanity and genius go hand in hand, blah, blah, blah. Everybody's crazy. And it's so hard for me to think about how so many great artists, their greatness is attributed to the fact that they were crazy. Like, if I ever become famous, I really don't want to just be known as, oh yeah, she was a psycho and she painted pictures and that's why her pictures were good. I would hate to be dumbed down to that. Anyway, to tie into our next bit, we're going to talk about what did inspire Van Gogh and the truth behind his paintings. During his first summer in Arles, he used palettes to paint landscapes and traditional rural life, and he always believed that there was this power that existed behind natural scenery, and he always tried to capture this power, especially using symbols. He was, as I said earlier, he studied religion, and he was very religious for some time, and so he always tried to incorporate religious symbols into his artwork. And the famous example of this is the painting The Sower, that he copied at first from Jean-François Millet, and this reflected his religious belief, and the sower was supposed to be Christ sowing life beneath the hot sun. And these were themes and motifs that he constantly returned to, and he would constantly try and rework them in, develop them, and he just really wanted to show you and use his paintings as a way of demonstrating Christian iconography with his own style. And in Arles, after having gained confidence after painting spring blossoms and learning to capture bright sunlight, he painted his own version of The Sower. And he often stayed within what he called the guise of reality, and he was very, very critical of his work, which again, as an artist, I can relate to. People always say, wow, I mean, you have so many paintings. And it's like, yeah, I would have so many more if I hadn't burned half of them, or even 3/4 of them. But it's so hard. I'm always my own worst critic, and I'm sure the artists listening definitely feel me, where you see you see the creation of the piece. It's like, sometimes you're painting, but you're also watching yourself paint, and you see every detail, you see, every little nook and cranny, the way it was laid, and sometimes you look at it for so long that you see nothing but the flaws, and someone else looks at it and just sees nothing but perfection. And so really go back to that quote, that old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if you behold it for too long, I may add, all of a sudden you're looking at a completely different something. Anyway, he was very critical of his work, and he wrote about Starry Night and said that it was too abstract and the reality was gone, and it was just he thought it was over the top. And it's interesting, the painting he might have hated the most, he is now the most well known for. And Hughes describes it as a moment of extreme visionary ecstasy. The stars are in a great whirl reminiscent of Hokusai's Great Wave. If you guys know the painting I'm talking about, props to you. If not, definitely look up Hokusai's Great Wave. Once you see it, you'll know. The movement in the heaven above is reflected by the movement of the cypress on the earth below, and the painter's vision is translated into a thick, emphatic plasma of paint. I personally feel like if that was my painting, I would have hated the way that it was overly described. But at the same time, everything that Hughes says is 100% true of Starry Night. And his paintings, Van Gogh's paintings, often reflected the culture around him. As I mentioned before, he traveled around quite a bit, and he had a few different occupations, first as an art dealer, then attempted as a preacher, and then an artist. And so he did move around a lot. He saw a lot of life, and he always, when he was living in France, he painted the French countryside, the French restaurants. When he moved, he painted more of where he was, his surroundings, and he was very consistent of trying to represent where he was in life. And fun fact number 1, he actually painted more than 43 self-portraits between 1885 and 1889. 43 completed paintings. But may I say, 43 completed paintings of himself. This does not include the total count of number of paintings that he painted over those 4 years. It's just incredible. He worked with mad ferocity. He was at it all the time, and I find that truly inspiring as well, where he was so gifted and he was so creative, and he saw in such a beautiful, unique way that he could just go at it constantly all the time. If anything, that is what we should strive to achieve, to be so passionate that nothing can disrupt our focus. And now to jump into my favorite part of each episode, fun facts and conspiracy theories. And in great contrast to last week's episode about the Mona Lisa, there's very few conspiracy theories about Van Gogh. I'm guessing a lot of it is because it's a completely different time period. We actually have photographs of Van Gogh. We know a lot more about his life. There's all these letters between him and his brother Theo. So there's a clearer record of his life and of his works. So there's not actually a whole lot of mysteries surrounding him. He was I don't want to say he was a simple man. He had a very complex mind and a very difficult life. But he wasn't like Da Vinci, where he was hiding a riddle or a code in every brushstroke. So there's actually only 3. And the first one is Van Gogh's painting The Cafe Terrace at Night is sometimes believed to be his version of The Last Supper. Yay! We get to talk about Da Vinci because you guys are not sick of Leonardo da Vinci, right? If you don't know The Cafe Terrace at Night and you are not operating a motor vehicle, definitely look it up. I no longer care if you're at work. Remember how Van Gogh had a thing for the religious symbolism? Yeah, so do I, because I just said it. Researcher Jared Baxter thinks that the Van Gogh painting is a homage to Da Vinci's Last Supper. Seriously though, everyone's so obsessed with the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, it's a little creepy. But you can definitely see where he's coming from. If you look closely at Van Gogh's piece, There's a figure who is actually believed to be a waiter, and he has very long hair, and he's standing in the middle of this restaurant terrace surrounded by 12 individuals, 2 of whom are actually cats. And then there's another person off in the side, kind of creeping into the shadows, and people believe that this is a representation of Judas. And there's actually a lot of evidence for this theory, which actually makes it less of a conspiracy theory and more of just this is what's kind of believed, because there's actual evidence from the artist himself. Because he wrote a note to Theo around the same time that he painted this work. He referenced the painting and said he had a tremendous need for, shall I say the word, religion. So he kind of hinted that he was working with religious symbols, and we later on found that that was actually true and that he did work with a lot of religious symbols. So it would only make sense that he, even if he wasn't basing it off of Da Vinci's Last Supper, he may have painted his own version. I mean, even think about it. It's a restaurant. It's late in the evening. It's literally called Cafe Terrace at night. Last Supper. Dinner time. Anyway, Baxter further points out that there's multiple crosses in the painting, including one in the window right above the person who might be Jesus. But even if the theory is true, it's not shocking or surprising or anything like the Mona Lisa alien theory, just because he was a religious man at one point. It would only make sense that he included religious symbols in his paintings. I believe he also had a few paintings of churches and whatnot, and so it would be a very common symbol. Still, it's a really cool theory, and I liked it, not just because it had to do with Da Vinci. The second theory was a really good theory until it was debunked through research, but it was the theory that Van Gogh was colorblind. However, there was intensive research done into his development as an artist, and it revealed that color was actually one of his prime concerns, so there's actually no frickin' way that he was colorblind. Early on, in relation to color theory, he began reading books about color theory and how this could be applied, and he had only ever seen this one guy, this artist, Eugene Delacroix's paintings in real life, but he studied them in books to see how he could achieve the same color effects. And so there's actually no way that he could have been colorblind, because you have to be able to see the tones and the vibrance and whatnot to achieve color effects. Otherwise it would have been random. Second is powerful contrasts. He combined complementary colors in his paintings often. So yellows versus blues, like you think of Starry Night, the big contrasts in between the dark sky and the bright yellow stars, and then the green trees. It's all very powerful, and if you're colorblind, you really can't differentiate between a lot of tones. So the fact that he applied these color theories so flawlessly would mean that there's no way he could have actually been colorblind. So that the research, it actually wasn't that hard to debunk the theory, but it was actually believed for a very long time that he was colorblind, and that's why his paintings were so textured. But the research actually proved that to be false. And the third and final conspiracy theory is, and of course it is the longest as per tradition. Is it a tradition if you've only done 2 episodes? I don't know. We'll find out next week. Third time's the charm, guys. So this third conspiracy theory is that Van Gogh was murdered. He died, this is what's really sad to me, is he died 29 hours after being shot in the stomach in a wheat field in Paris in 1890. And on his deathbed, he told the doctors around him that he had shot himself. So it's traditionally been believed ever since that he did commit suicide and he shot himself. However, Dr. Vincent Di Maio, an expert on gunshot injuries, has said that he believes the wound was not actually self-inflicted. According to Vanity Fair, and this is when I start reading, so I get my reading voice on, I noticed in my last episode that when I was editing, whenever I started reading my notes even, or a quote, I get this different voice. So I don't know if that's just me that noticed it, and now I've told all of you guys, but either way, here's my reading voice. Di Maio, who was a key witness at the George Zimmerman trial, said that it was highly likely that Van Gogh did not shoot himself. And this article was super weird because they put things like not self-inflicted and did not shoot himself in quotes. And I'm not really sure why, but just so you know, I'm doing air quotes every time I read it. He made the claim in response to a request by Stephen Naife and Gregory White-Smith, whose biography of Van Gogh disputes the long-held suicide theory. In Van Gogh, The Life, a 960-page book published in 2011, the Pulitzer Prize-winning authors claim that the artist had been shot, possibly accidentally, by a couple of boys, and that he had decided to protect them by accepting the blame. And the reason they came upon this conclusion was because John Rewald heard these local rumors in the village that he had died in the 1930s. But these guys were actually later on attacked for publishing this theory because it didn't seem very likely that he would have wanted to protect these teenage boys literally when he was about to die, especially if they'd shot him. Like, you'd want justice even if you were gonna die, especially if you were gonna die. Anyway, Van Tilborg and Miedendorp, I love these names, I'm so good with names, wrote that the son of the attendant physician at Van Gogh's deathbed, Paul Jr., said Van Gogh's wound had a brown and purple halo around it. Again, quotations. According to the authors, this meant, quotations, the gun must have been fired at very close range and was caused by the bullet's impact. But Di Maio said, in fact, the purple halo is subcutaneous bleeding from vessels cut by the bullet and is usually seen in individuals who live a while. Its presence or absence means nothing. So now we have this kind of argument between two specialists where one say that what they mean is the purple ring would be a bruise, is caused by impact. The other one said that it's just it forms if you bleed for a while after being shot. I know nothing about medicine, so I can neither confirm nor deny either theory. However, so he talked about the purple ring. Now, in response about the brown ring, he said it's an abrasion ring and is seen around virtually all entrance wounds. I've never had an entrance wound. I wouldn't know. I want to believe him, though, because he's a specialist. Di Maio also said that if Van Gogh did shoot himself, there would have been soot, powder, tattooing, and searing of the skin around the entrance, because it would have been at such close range, I'm guessing, that those guns back then were very unreliable. They produced quite a lot of soot and soot and dust particles and gunpowder, so it would have marred the wound. However, the forensic accounts actually don't reveal any of this, and so this actually indicates that the muzzle was more than a foot or two away. And so in conclusion, he said, "It is my opinion that, in all medical probability, the wound incurred by Van Gogh was not self-inflicted. In other words, he did not shoot himself." I really like how overly explained that was, but okay. However, Di Maio's theory does not completely sway the academic opinion. A curator at the Van Gogh Museum told Naife, I don't know. I always do this. I always say it two different ways and then just say I don't know as if somebody is going to correct me. You can correct me on Twitter if you want. Self-proclaimed shout out right there. he told them in an email, "I think it would be like Vincent to protect the boys and take the accident as an unexpected way out of his burdened life. But I think the biggest problem you'll find after publishing your theory is that the suicide is more or less printed in the brains of the past and present generations and has become a sort of self-evident truth. Vincent's suicide has become the grand finale of the story of the martyr for art. It's his crown of thorns." And I love that quote because it's so true, but I also hate it because it's so true. We're so obsessed with the mental illness that it makes sense that he would have committed suicide, and in a way we sort of get, I don't know, this sense of gratification almost from the fact that he took his own life, where we just kind of get this neat little story tied into a bow, whereas if he was murdered, that kind of creates some loose ends. It is reported that he was pretty much an unpleasant, crazy man, and so he would have probably had a lot of enemies, but people just really romanticize the idea of suicide, and they really just, it's true, it's printed in our brains that the guy killed himself, and so even if the forensic analysis reveals otherwise, people are still gonna believe he shot himself. I don't know. I have to sneeze. I don't know. I don't want to believe he killed himself because I don't want to say it's the ultimate defeat. It's not. But as someone who's been in that dark place before, it's sad to me that he lost the battle. However, I really don't like the idea that he was murdered either. But I don't know, I guess we all have to die from something. So anyway, that's it for conspiracy theories. Van Gogh. That's Van Gogh in a nutshell. I really want to talk more about Starry Night and his the way he detested it. But that's for another episode. I don't want these to be too long. So we have our concluding credits. The podcast was narrated by Emma Hewen. I did all the research. I edited it. I drank the beer for it. I do the social media. You get the idea. The only thing not done by me is the music, which is by Benjamin Dougherty. And if you liked what you heard tonight, you may go ahead and look us up on Instagram at Art Uncensored Podcast. We also have a Facebook page, or you can tweet us at Art Uncensored PC. Or if you have no social media, you can email us at artuncensoredpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're interested in me, which, again, as I always say, totally flattered if you are, can't blame you if you're not, you can visit my personal Instagram at usepaintwater, or my Twitter. I actually don't know what my Twitter is. I'm pretty sure it's like M_Hewen. I mostly just retweet the Art Uncensored tweets and talk about, I don't know, beer. Anyway, thank you for listening. Have a great night.